All right, guys, welcome back to another article review. This is on Jiu-Jitsu, so factors that influence injury occurrence in Jiu-Jitsu competitors. Okay, it's published in the International Journal of Sports and Exercise Medicine, and as always, it's cited at the bottom just in case you want to follow along or if you want to look it up after we go over it. All right, so the introduction. It starts off by defining Jiu-Jitsu in the way that, they kind of a broad explanation of Jiu-Jitsu for the people who may be watching it. Okay, they also discuss some of the physiological exercise that they consider BJJ to be. So whether it's aerobic or anaerobic and how you kind of bounce back and forth in between the two energy systems. And they also go on to talk about how the research really does, and this is not uncommon. So with the growing popularity in a sport or growing popularity anywhere, it always takes time for the research to kind of catch up because it takes time to do these research. You got to find people to participate in them and do the interviews. Like, for example, in this article, the people do interviews, and it's a survey research. So it just takes a lot of time. You have to go through peer review. So the sport actually ballooned way faster than the research could catch up. Okay, so then they go on to also talk about some of the differences between intrinsic versus extrinsic risk factors. Intrinsic risk factors, just for example, being like height or race, something like that. And then intrinsic risk factors would be something like your training, the specificities of the training or the environment or the climate. Okay, so for the methods, what they did was they essentially gave an interview to a group of jiu-jitsu practitioners. And so this would be described as a descriptive epidemiological study. Epidemiology is just the study of kind of the incidence and prevalence of certain health-related conditions, who has them, why did they have them, and they study the different patterns. Okay, and descriptive just means that they're looking at, again, certain patterns within this certain epidemiology. So for this would be, the injury occurrence in jiu-jitsu is what they're tracking, and then they're trying to find patterns that may be able to either reduce or increase the risk of injury in jiu-jitsu practitioners. So they interviewed 374, and 93.6% of them were male, roughly 6.5 were female, and then the average age was 24 years old, plus or minus 8 years. And they essentially just answered questions from the interviewees about their training. They had a questionnaire that they gave, and they just kind of ran them through several different questions. And so the way that they did their statistics, we're not going to go too much into this, was just a logistic regression model. Regression models just look at the relationships between the independent and dependent variables here. So the dependent variable would be injury occurrence, and then the independent variables would be things like age and time spent practicing, time spent warming up, the amount of time you've been in the sport, which we'll go over that in just a second here. And then the chi-squared analysis is just how you find a good fit. Okay, so the significance of those relationships between the different between the independent variable and the different independent variables. So what are the results? This is what we want to know. Okay, so one of the things that they ask folks is what was happening whenever you got injured. And so for this particular table on the right, this is only interviewing the people who had been injured prior to the study. So takedowns, not to most people's surprise, were most frequent cause of injury. Okay, but we have to also understand that 118 of the 314 that were interviewed for this specific portion, those who had previously been injured, did not remember. So they also kind of stratified this into a different graph of those who had been previously injured. So the people in this particular portion of the interview, 67%, 23%, and 10% had either 1, 2, or 3 injuries respectively. So even though they had already been injured, some of them had already been injured twice and even 3 times. And that comes with just time in the sport, which we'll look at here in a second. But I thought that was pretty interesting. Just kind of intuitively, it makes sense that takedowns are high effort, a lot of times explosive, and they kind of lend itself to more maybe susceptibility to injury. The results continued. Okay, so this is where we're going to get into what the study actually found and kind of expounded upon a lot in the actual discussion and the results. So the chance of injury occurring is 3 times higher in folks who do jiu-jitsu 3 to 4 times a week than 1 to 2 times a week. I don't know that this is necessarily intuitive. You'd think you're training, 1 to 2 times as much, your injury rate might go up 1 to 2 times, or maybe go up twice, but it's actually 3 times. So the more you're on the mats, the more likely you are to get injured. But if you go from 1 to 2 times a week to 3 to 4 times a week, your injury rate goes up significantly, 3 times in fact. And this value actually increased to 6 times in practitioners that train 5 to 6 times a week. So that's pretty interesting. Like you wouldn't necessarily think that if you increase by 1 or 2 days that you would almost think that it would double, but it actually increases to 3 times and 6 times. So a lot of it probably depends on the type of training you're doing, how repetitive it is, and we'll talk about that in the limitations later, but I found that pretty interesting. And so the next thing that they found that was statistically significant, kind of intuitive, but the chance of injury occurring is greater the longer the interviewee practices jiu-jitsu compared to interviewees who practice less than a year. Okay, so if you practice less than a year, you're less likely to get injured than folks who practice for more than 11 years, right? So you can see it. I've highlighted it here on the graph. 3 to 5 years, the odds ratio just kind of increases steadily until you get to about 7 to 9 years, and then it jumps up to 5 times more likely. And then once you practice more than 11 years, that doubles again to the odds ratio being 11. So pretty interesting how just a couple years of gap can make you either more or less likely to be injured according to this study. Okay, so again, we'll talk about the limitations here of what this means, but obviously the more you practice, the more likelihood you have of getting injured. But a lot of that does hinge on the type of training that you're doing. And then the other statistically significant, even though it was relatively weak, was the longer the duration of the warm-up, the less the chance of injury. Now, this obviously isn't saying that you should warm up for 2 hours, but the way the odds ratios work, if you look over to the side, this is only 0.985. So the way the odds ratios work is if it's above 1 or below 1. Okay, so since it was statistically significant, it was relatively weak since it's pretty close to 1, since it's 0.985. But essentially what this is saying is this is negatively correlated. So the more you warm up, the less likely you are to be injured. Unlike the other ones that we looked at previously, so the more you practice, the more likely you are. These are positively correlated. Okay, and then pain during warm-up. This was an interesting one. So when the interviewee had some pain or discomfort, it doubled the chances of that person getting injured compared to someone who does not have pain or discomfort while warming up. Now, it didn't delineate whether they had pain when they started warming up or whether they had pain at the end of the warm-up or whether that pain kind of gradually went away. I would imagine that the pain existed throughout the entire warm-up and then persisted after the warm-up, and that's what doubled your chance of getting injured. So that was a pretty cool one. I really didn't expect to see something like that showing up in here, but this is a question that they asked and one that was statistically significant. So let's talk about some of the strengths. So this seems to be applicable to most recreational athletes in jiu-jitsu because they compete every so often. They're not ultra competitive because they would be training a lot more and their training would probably look a lot different. And the fact that it was a convenient sample can kind of make it a little bit more applicable to just most recreational BJJ athletes. And they did validate their stats. They found a goodness of fit with the chi-squared analysis and make sure that their model was good for making the claims that they were making. Now, some of the limitations, it was descriptive in nature, right? So the less objective data we have, the less we can say. It was survey, depending on what it is, right? Sometimes we like descriptive studies, but this I would consider it a limitation in this article. So the fact that it is a survey, all right, so this kind of ties into the fourth bullet point. We have to trust that the response of the athletes are true. They could be lying. I don't know. They're not incentivized to lie here. And we have to make sure that they're accurately recalling what happened. We saw that in one of those figures that the athlete, like 114 athletes, didn't remember how they were injured. So, and it's also a sample of convenience, right? So if we're trying to make specific claims about specific populations, which I don't think they're trying to do here, they're trying not to be super specific, we'd like to have a pretty rigorous inclusion criteria. You have to meet these standards in order to be in the study so that we eliminate, and try to control for this as much as we can. But this was a sample of convenience. Like a lot of epidemiological studies, it's hard to get people to participate in them. Okay, so now we're going to go into the discussion, implications. Of course, this is where we cut off for the free YouTube version. My Patreon, it's only $5 a month. We talk about actual implications whenever we discuss training in a little bit more detail on the Patreon. So go check that out if you want. But if not, this is, I don't want to put you in any sort of financial hardship, but this is where the video ends. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.